literature before 1800 and English literature after 1800. Okay? So you guys need to get in my time machine. Okay? This classroom is a time machine. I'm Dr. Who. Here's my electronic screwdriver right here. We are going to go through time in our time machine to the late 1700s. Okay? Blake was born about in the mid 1700s and died in the early 1800s. Thinking about the Enlightenment period, which preceded the 1800s, this is a movement of intellectual thought that emphasized rationalism, that emphasized the best way to live your life is using reason, using your brain right here. This is the best way to work through things. After all, we're not animals, right? The only thing that keeps us from the animals, from being no better than a pig who's wallowing in his own mud and feces and things like that, sorry for the horrible image, is the fact that we can use our brain to get beyond those circumstances. And that was the Enlightenment movement. You saw people in these movements who were like some of our founding fathers in the United States of America, like Thomas Jefferson and folks like that. They were emphasizing reason, the need to use reason to overcome some of these awful things that we're facing in our lives. But as we move toward the 18th century, some folks of the Romantic period, that's the new period that's going to be starting at the 18th century, this new period of intellectual thought, they're going to be emphasizing, instead of reason as the primary thing that makes us human, emotion, these kinds of things. Instead of emphasizing rationality, emphasizing the fact that humans can't deny that there are some elements of us that are irrational. We can't deny our emotions. It's okay to love. It's okay to have immense feelings of care for other people. You don't have to back off of everything and look at it coolly and objectively. So that's going to be kind of where we're going. William Blake kind of falls in between these two movements right here, these two intellectual movements. He comes up while the Enlightenment rationalism is still in full swing, and he sounds like he's absolutely nuts, okay? Some of the things that he's talking about, okay? It's not in vogue at the time, so hence he's pretty poor. Not a lot of people are reading his work, okay, because he's not fashionable. But as we move into the 1800s, a lot of people are going to be seeing Blake as a founding father of this this romantic movement that emphasizes some of these different themes that I was talking about. So that's why we are using Blake, and that's why we're talking about Blake at the beginning of this period of this class, because I think he's an excellent figure. We're about to walk into a couple of authors named Coleridge and Wordsworth. And these two folks are basically the founding fathers of the Romantic movement in poetry. So see some of these different transitions and thoughts that I'm trying to establish here. Versus emotion. Another thing that we want to emphasize about this period is kind of where some of these ideas, the historical things that are happening that make them pop up. Okay, so we in the Around this time period, we're beginning to see the industrialization of the world. People are starting to move away. Most people were, prior to this time, living on farms. Okay? They were making their living from the land. They were plowing, they were growing crops, they were eating the food off of the land here. They looked up to the landowner here. They were mostly poor, but they lived off of the land or some skills. We're going to see in Silas Marner. Silas Marner is a guy who is able to live off of the work of his hands. He is able to make clothes. Okay, so we begin to see this merchant class and stuff like that. But then gradually, at this time period, people were moving off of the farms and they're moving to the cities, these largely industrialized cities. And these cities are being full of these giant machinery. Okay, people are working in factories. Like my brother. My brother works in a factory, has worked in a factory most of his life, still today. He works in like a cheese packing plant. Works long hours, 16 hours a day. He's been doing it for about 30 years. His knees are about worn out. And he about is to the point to where he can't do this work anymore because industrial work is pretty hard on the body. It's laborious, even today. But back then, it was terrible. All right. You know why we have child labor laws? It was because of how people were manipulating children at that time. Parents would make their children go to work at the age as soon as basically they were able to start moving around and understand basic, concepts, orders, and stuff like that. You got 9-year-olds working in a factory, and this machinery was poorly put together. They were still figuring out how to do these things. People were dying. These machines were breaking, and people were losing limbs and arms and stuff like this every day. The condition of labor was terrible. People were working 16-hour days, 18-hour days every day for pennies. Okay? But then later on, we're going to see labor unions being formed and stuff like that to protect workers from harsh conditions. But we haven't gotten there yet, okay? Later on, we're going to see labor laws that are going to be put in place that protect children from having to work in these harsh conditions at such an early age. They're not there yet. Imagine the city of London at this time. This is where Blake lives, okay? We're talking about English literature, so we're going to be talking about London, of course. It's the capital of England, Great Britain. London is a nasty, dark, stinky, smelly place. No modern sewage, okay? You imagine just throwing your daily, doings into the street. And a lot of people doing that every day. You imagine how bad that smells. Okay? You imagine coal. The whole town was fueled by coal. Have you ever had a barbecue grill and picked up a bunch of coal and then had it in your hands and then looked at your hands after that? See how black your hands were and you accidentally put your hands on your face? We had little chimney sweepers. These were young kids, and they were having to go down into these chimneys. Their parents were lowering them down into a tall chimney because the parents couldn't fit in that chimney in order to clean it out. They come out covered in black soot and stuff like that. You know what coal does to your lungs after several years? A lot of these kids didn't live very long. A lot of them would get caught in there. Bad things happening in London. And so we have William Blake, who is a man who hates this industrialized society, who hates what he sees in London. And so we have this poem, London. Blake favors the agrarian society as opposed to the industrial society. He hates what he's seeing is happening to the society that's moving from the agricultural toward the industrial. And here, Brett, he pictures London. Let me just make sure that everybody in WebEx can hear me, can see what I'm showing. Okay, so here we have the poem London, which I asked you to read. And this is a poem that presents a London through the eyes of a speaker who sees all kinds of problems with this place, with this city. Okay? Remember how I told you the other day, when you read a poem, think about who is the speaker, what is the situation, who is the auditor. Who the auditor means the person that that speaker is listening, is talking to. The speaker of this poem is clearly in a setting, in a place, London. And I told you when that place was, around the 1800s. A little bit before that, late 1700s. 1784 is when this was published. And he tells about his experience of going through London. What did he see through his own eyes, his perspective? Remember I told you about that theme or that thematic topic the other day? Perspective, and that how that can shape how we see the world. Write some thematic topics up here on the board. Now, if you watch my introductory videos, you know a thematic topic is usually a word or phrase that's a thread of meaning that's going on in a work of literature. We talked about perspective yesterday. We also talked about innocence and experience. And what we're going to be trying to figure out as we do a first level analysis, as we do a close reading of this poem and all the other poems, is a thematic statement, okay? And a thematic topic plus a thematic comment, that's the formula I have, equals a thematic statement. Now, a lot of students in my classes get a little frustrated because they try to start right here. They try to start with the end of the equation. They try to say, oh man, I can't figure out what that is. But that's not how our minds work. Our minds work with, first off, identifying this right here. Right, oh, this poem says something about innocence. Or this poem says something about perspective. Or in the case of this poem, I'll go ahead and say that this poem says something about the experience of industrial society. That's what I said right here. Sorry, folks online, I just realized that I walked away from you, but some of the things that I wrote on the board over there is I wrote some thematic topics, and some of the thematic topics that I wrote over there were innocence and experience, and I also wrote the experience of industrial society. So what I'm trying to do for everybody is put together a thematic statement off of this poem right here. And I'm about to walk everybody through this poem. So, I wish there was a way that I can move the camera. Oh, there we are. How about that? Okay, now they can see me. All right. London. So, remember I said a good way to try to understand a poem is to read through it 3 times. So you can see that I've reached the 3rd and the 4th and probably the 5th time reading through this in my annotations right here. Up at the top right of my annotations, you'll see some of the things that I tell you to consider when you're reading a poem in order to begin trying to figure out what it means. Some of those things are the speaker, the situation, word choice, and figurative language. All of these are poetic elements that we might use to analyze a poem. I've already talked about the speaker and the situation. Now let's look through the word choice. I'm going to read through it out loud for you. London. I wandered through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's year, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So we know that clearly from just reading that once, he's not very happy about what he sees. There's lots of imagery in the poem. If you don't know what an image is, it's a picture, okay? And it's a picture that's supposed to make us feel a certain type of way. When we see these pictures that he paints, clearly we're supposed to feel the sorrow of the people that he's talking about. Some of the images he has is a face full of weakness and woe. He uses that picture to touch our hearts. Another image we see is an infant crying of fear. We're supposed to picture an infant in our minds. We're supposed to picture the chimney sweepers crying. That's an image. A blackened church. That's an image. And actually, from William Blake's society, he would know that the churches would be covered in blackness of coal. The whole town was just sticky with coal. And the hapless soldiers sighing, an image of blood running down the palace walls after the soldiers are shot in execution style. And then we're hearing harlots cursing at newborn infants. We're supposed to get a picture of that, as well as a plague of a marriage hearse. Okay, so lots of these images show a town that is suffering. Now, we got to ask ourselves, why is it suffering? Remember I said this was a thematic topic? What is it like to be in an industrial society? The way that you can get from here to here is by phrasing this as a question, okay? So I said, what is the experience like of industrial society? What is it like to live in an industrial society? For those of you online, what I just wrote was, what is it like to live in the experience of an industrial society? And if this poem answers that question right here, how about some of y'all in class or online, if y'all want to chime in? You maybe want to take a guess at what this poem is trying to say it's like to live in an industrial society. Pretty awful, okay? Okay. Pretty awful. You clearly pointed at several things that aren't as good as perhaps they used to be. Anybody else? Having torture? Heading towards your death. Okay, good point. Yeah. All right. What? Dark. Yeah, it's pretty dark. Thanks, Landry. Yeah. Corrupted. I like that one. I like them all. All right. So we can turn this into a thematic statement. The experience of industrial society is corrupt, dark, deadly, awful. Each of these are a talking point. If you've ever written a thesis statement before, you know a thesis statement starts out with an argumentative claim, and then it's got a because clause, and it's got several points of discussion. These are 1, 2, 3, 4 points of discussion. What I wrote was corrupt, dark, deadly, awful, the experience of industrial society. Now we have a thematic statement. We got to prove that by pointing to evidence from the text. And that's where your post, that's your thesis statement. You start right here. You say, this is proven by the marks of weakness and woe, by infants crying, by infants suffering of fear. This is proven by the cries of the chimney sweepers and the blackened churches. This is proven by the blood running down palace walls. This is proven by the curses of the harlots and by the newborn infant's tears. And this is proven by the blights of the marriage hearse, which can be implied. You might have to know a little bit more. At the time, syphilis was a common problem and stuff like that. And so lots of people would visit prostitution rings and they would get syphilis and then they carry it back to their wives and it would kill their wives and it would kill their children and stuff like that. It was a bad thing. Life is pretty bleak right now, okay? And I'm not a bleak dude, so I want to move on a little bit from this. But do you see how I'm emphasizing some of these word choice here as well? Chartered. If you wanted to keep digging into this poem a little further, you might ask yourself, why? Why is it that these people suffer so much? And I think one reason why I like that word corrupt so much is because it leads us in a new direction in analysis of the poem. If you say, well, why are we suffering? Why are they suffering is a different way. Why is the experience of industrial society so awful? That might be another way to put it. Say why. And it's because of corruption, corruption in the church, corruption in the political realm, where soldiers are being used, because society is captivating us, is controlling us, instead of letting us have freedom like we had when we were in an agrarian society, presumably. Even looking at this word choice right here, talking about control, even the streets are chartered. That word implies control. Even the river is controlled. And I don't think some people blame harlots and sin and stuff like that. I think Blake is, instead of blaming like harlots for what they're doing, it seems like if you know Blake a little better, he's probably blaming society, which forces people into prostitution, which forces people to do that. It's economics, because these people don't have enough money to live, so they're forced to go into prostitution. And prostitution kind of forces them to do that right there. Go ahead. Mhm. That might be one way to look at it right there. Uh, it seems as if when you get married, you're going to the grave. And there's not a lot of evidence to point at, talking about young women getting married because of their parents, but I think that that could be implied. And sometimes you don't have to fully know something. You could just say, this could imply this, right? Um, I think when you think about that a little further, fathers are at that time controlling their kids, right? They're controlling where their kids can go. They can't follow their hearts and can't follow their love. Blake doesn't like any aspect of control. He likes freedom, which is one reason why he liked America so much, as opposed to Britain with an authoritarian, king. So I think you're going somewhere there. Keep digging in that. I agree, Bryson. I think it sounds like a very sad and depressing time. That's why I'm going to swap gears. I'm a pretty happy dude, and I'm going to look at some of the other poems because there's two sides of this. Okay, look at Infant Joy. I have no name. I am but 2 days old. Remember what I told you the speaker and the situation and the event of this poem was and the auditor? It would help if there were quotation marks here. So over on the side right here, I wrote for each person who's speaking. First off, we start with a child, then the mother, child, mother, for the rest of the poem. Since a child at 2 days old can't talk, I mean, you have the option of imagining, how this is happening. Either this is happening in the imagination of the mother, okay, or it's happening in the imagination of the poet, and the poet is actually giving the child liberty to talk. But the most common way of interpreting this poem is we've got a mother who has just given birth to a child 2 days ago. She's very happy. Got a question? How are you? I'm doing well. I'm happy. Let's see. We got a mother who's given birth to a child 2 days ago, and she's very happy to have her child. I can relate to this poem in a second level analysis because I have my own daughter. She's 9 years old. I remember when she was born, how happy I was. At the same time, looking at infant sorrow, I remember also, the child wasn't happy when it was born, very unhappy. And I was scared as well. She was born premature. She had to be in one of those NICUs for a couple weeks, couldn't feed herself for a while. I was scared. But reading this poem, I'm not thinking about any of those things. I'm thinking about the joy that I felt. So I can see from the mother's perspective in a second level of analysis, what she's going through. So we have this mother who gives the child liberty to talk. And remember how I said Blake and how he likes liberty as opposed to confinement, right? Or control. Here we have a child who's given the liberty to talk. The mother, and it's given to by the mother. The mother, instead of the mother naming the child names himself. Okay, in the poem. She says, "What shall I call thee?" And the child says, "I happy am. Joy is my name." Look at how even the child has the liberty to not use proper grammatical rules. Okay, I happy am. There's no judgment. We think it's cute, right? Joy is my name. Sweet joy befall thee. Look at all the different aspects. So another way to analyze a poem is to do it by characterization, okay? The character of this child is pretty, sweet, happy, joyful. All of these are aspects of the child's character. But looked at in another way, this poem talks about the thematic comment of joy. And it also talks about innocence. We know that because this poem is found within, as I said the other day, the collection of poems called Songs of Innocence. So you could phrase that thematic topic as a question. What does the poem say about the nature of joy? Or where does it come from? Where does joy come from? What causes joy? What is innocence like? Just from reading this poem, what are some things that we can derive about the experience of joy or innocence? Think about the mother and her character and the child, his or her character. innocent. So joy is innocent. Okay? To be innocent is to be joyful, carefree. To be innocent is both joyful and carefree. Childlike. Okay. Let me write this down. I'm losing. Okay. Running out of space. Now I'm going to write this as a full thematic statement, kind of in the form, y'all need to be writing yours. Ouch. Yeah, I remembered two of them. Joy, being carefree, and childlike. I like that one. Seeing if y'all can see that online. But from online, what I just wrote down was William Blake's infant joy implies that innocence is characterized by joy, by being carefree, and by being childlike, by each of these three things. I might say by being joyful. I might work on my wording a little bit right there just to make it make grammatical sense. By being joyful, by being childlike. You can keep playing with the grammar right there to make it a little better. But I wanted to derive something from what y'all were saying in class right here. When you write your thematic statements, be sure to include the full author's name. Be sure to include the work of literature that you're talking about. And then our thematic topic here is innocence. What does this poem say about the experience of innocence? It's being characterized by being joyful, carefree, and childlike. Okay? And then in the essay text itself, in the body of your post, you're going to prove that by saying that the mother in the poem calls her child joy. That all of these different things. The mother is joyful as well as the child, and the child's joy inspires the mother to be joyful because she sings, and all of these various things. Now, the other day, I mistakenly dismissed class at 9:50 because I got confused. I thought class, like every other semester, it ended at 9:50. So I realize now that the class lasts until 10. So I'm going to push us until, the way I work with class is I'll usually work until about 5 minutes before. I'll try to wrap things up and try to have y'all out by about 2 minutes before class ends. But I ask that, everybody try to pay attention until those last 2 minutes, and I will definitely make sure to get us out before everything's over. Cool? All right. Why don't we? All right, so we have Bryson adds a nice little comment right there. A newborn child represents innocence. I think that Blake is arguing that as well. I would agree with that. That a newborn child can inspire innocence. Go ahead. Yes, I like the way you put that right there. And what's your name? I'm sorry. Hey, Michaela. Thanks. You introduced yourself the other day, but you had a different mask. So these folks, Bryson and Michaela, are talking about another aspect of analysis, which is symbolism. Okay. And so motherhood typically represents caring, it typically represents uh, care of a child, stuff like that. Um, but at the same time, if you look at it from Blake's eyes, when he talks about innocence versus experience, you'll see that the early days of motherhood is characterized by innocence. I think that's what you're saying right there. The early days of motherhood are characterized by innocence, whereas the later days of motherhood might be a quite different experience. Um, and there's actually a poem by Blake I'd like to start looking at as illustrations as we go forward. There's a poem by Blake where uh, we have a. I'm just going to have to show you the picture. I have to pull it up. I'll pull that up next time. But let's take a look at infant sorrow right now, because I think that's a nice contrast with this one here. One other thing I want to say about these poems, I want to make this thing go down. Trying to get behind there. In your discussion forums, I have some of these poems coupled together. Okay, in the Blake discussion forum, I encouraged you to analyze at least 2 of his poems. This little poem right here is not long enough for you to write an effective answer about on your exam. But if you combine it with infant joy, it might be long enough. I have had students in the past write about infant joy and infant sorrow and struggle to write enough simply because they are both pretty short poems. When you're choosing what poems to write about, think about the length of the poem, okay? London and Jerusalem are longer poems. You'll have more to write about. I never penalize for writing too much, okay? For writing too little, that's where the grades start falling down. So another common thing I'll have is I'll have people only have one talking point in their thesis statements. You see how I have 3 talking points right here? The more talking points you have, the better. You'll have more to write about. The more evidence you have, the more you'll have to write about. One of the better poems, I think, to write about in your discussion forum posts is, got to figure out how to make this thing not do that. It's Auguries of Innocence. Okay, that's the longest Blake poem. You're going to read that for next time. And there is a ton of evidence in there. You'll have a lot to write about, and that's a good thing. Okay, the more you have to write about, usually the longer you write, the more you write, usually the better the grade. Almost all of them. But in the discussion forum posts, I combined a couple of poems and I said, you can write about this and this poem. So infant joy and infant sorrow are one. One I didn't list in the discussion forum that you could use is the lamb and the tiger. Both of those poems are excellent fodder for the discussion forum post. Look at this poem in contrast. So you might have to have 2 thematic statements if you talk about 2 poems. William Blake's infant joy implies that innocence is characterized by being joyful, being carefree, and by being childlike. You might say, in contrast, William Blake's infant sorrow implies that, and I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to tell you one thing that this poem might imply after I read it. My mother groaned, my father wept, into the dangerous world I leapt, helpless, naked, piping loud, like a fiend hid in a cloud, struggling in my father's hands, striving against the swaddling bands. Bound and weary, I thought best to sulk upon my breast. I think one of the best ways to contrast these 2 poems is to talk about the experience of childbirth in particular. So like if you wrote a thematic statement that talked about what it was like to have a newborn child, you could say the experience of having a new child can be characterized by being joyful, by being carefree, and by being childlike. I had to tweak this one a little bit. You could say, in contrast, the experience of having a new child, as exemplified by infant sorrow, could be terrible, dangerous, awful, scary, fearful. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could say Dr. Red said something like this at some point. But the way it's organized in the discussion forum posts, I tell you how to organize it. You have the thematic statement in the introduction, like most thesis statements is in the introduction. Then you have a body or a couple of body paragraphs that prove it by digging into the text, by looking at word choice, speaker, auditor, situation, all these things. And the second level analysis belongs in the conclusion. Most always people put that in the conclusion. Cool. So think about these discussion forum posts as essays. You might not, you might have to do a first draft before you post it, like do some pre-writing, because most people don't figure out an interpretation of the poem at the beginning. Most people figure it out by the end of their pre-writing, and then they'll go back and organize their thoughts, putting the thesis statement that they figured out by writing at the beginning. Make sense? So the way I think I'm going to work Friday's class is I've set up a live broadcast, and I'm going to do this from my house, I think. We'll do this at 9:10. I'll have my computer up, my laptop, and I'll keep walking you through some more of these poems. Does everybody understand what we should be reading by Friday? That's right. So I've posted now an announcement for 821 that shows you what to do for Friday. It's an online class. I'll do a live broadcast meeting from my house. You watch that video, and then you'll have to summarize that video in 75 words. What I'll do is I'll keep digging through these poems, and I hope I can get to some of these illustrations